In 1943, as Britain fought across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, millions of its subjects in Bengal starved to death. In the fields where rice had once grown in abundance, crops withered under blight and storm. In towns and villages, grain vanished from the markets. Families collapsed in the streets, their bodies left unburied as disease followed hunger. At the same time, India was still expected to feed the imperial war machine, supplying troops, raw materials, and resources to sustain Britain's global campaign. The famine in Bengal was not the result of a single harvest failure, nor was it solely a natural disaster. It unfolded within the structures of empire, magnified by policy decisions, wartime demands, and the fragility of rural life under colonial rule. The Bengal famine claimed more than 2 million lives in less than 2 years. The catastrophe exposed how an imperial system prioritized war and political control over human survival. Bengal had long been one of India's richest provinces, a region where fertile soil and heavy monsoon rains produced rice in quantities sufficient to feed tens of millions. Yet its prosperity rested on a delicate balance. Small farmers lived from harvest to harvest with little buffer against disruption. Landlords, moneylenders, and traders extracted rents and debts that kept the majority perpetually vulnerable. Any shock to supply or distribution threatened to send prices spiraling beyond the reach of the poor. For more content, like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from. When war returned to Asia in 1939, Bengal's exposure deepened. British policy directed India's economy toward the needs of the global conflict, pulling food, shipping, and credit away from civilian markets. Japan's rapid advance through Southeast Asia after 1941 severed vital rice imports from Burma, a country whose exports had long sustained Bengal during lean years. Meanwhile, fears of Japanese invasion of eastern India drove the colonial government to adopt scorched earth measures in the coastal districts, destroying transport capacity and dismantling food networks in the name of military security. By 1942, the convergence of these pressures had destabilized Bengal's food system. When cyclones and fungal disease struck the rice crop, the province had no reserve to fall back on. Merchants and speculators responded to scarcity by hoarding stocks, driving prices to unprecedented levels. For the peasantry, who depended on selling small surpluses to buy grain during the hungry months before harvest, the inflation was catastrophic. Within months, families who had survived on the margins found themselves unable to purchase even a single meal. This was the context in which famine took root in Bengal. It did not strike with sudden force, but grew step by step from structural weakness, administrative decisions, and the crushing demands of global war. The British Empire, straining to hold its position against Axis powers, made choices that placed strategic calculations above the lives of its colonial subjects. In Bengal, those choices soon carried mortal weight, as hunger spread outward from the countryside to the very heart of Calcutta, where the imperial administration itself was seated. The famine's progression, and the question of how it could occur under a government that ruled one of the most fertile regions of Asia, remains central to understanding both the wartime empire and the human cost of imperial priorities. As 1943 began, Bengal stood on the threshold of disaster, its harvest already insufficient, its markets destabilized, and its people caught in a tightening grip of scarcity that showed no sign of relief. Bengal was one of the most densely populated regions in the world. By the early 1940s, more than 60 million people lived in the province, concentrated along the fertile plains of the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta. The landscape was defined by water as much as by land. Each year, monsoon rains swelled the rivers, depositing fresh silt that enriched the soil, but also carried the risk of flooding entire districts. Agriculture dominated every aspect of life, and rice was at the center of it. The grain was both staple and measure of survival. When the harvest was plentiful, the province seemed secure, but when it failed, the margin between subsistence and starvation was perilously thin. Despite the richness of the alluvial soil, Bengal's agricultural system was marked by deep structural weakness. The land was fragmented into countless small holdings, most of them leased from absentee landlords who drew rents through a hierarchy of middlemen. The permanent settlement of 1793, imposed by the East India Company, had established zamindars as hereditary landholders, responsible for delivering fixed revenues to the colonial state. Over time, many zamindars became little more than rent collectors, while actual cultivation was left to small tenants and sharecroppers who worked plots too small to sustain a family in lean years. Debts accumulated across generations, with moneylenders and traders seizing land when rents or loans went unpaid. By the 20th century, the majority of Bengal's cultivators lived on the edge of dispossession, lacking reserves of food or capital to withstand crisis. Rice dominated not only production but also diet, leaving little space for diversification. Pulses, vegetables, and oilseeds were grown in modest quantities, but rice accounted for the overwhelming share of cultivated acreage. This monoculture meant that any disruption, whether through pests, floods, or trade interruption, could destabilize food availability across the province. The system was highly sensitive to fluctuations in price. Because most cultivators consumed more than they produced, they depended on buying grain during the hungry months between planting and harvest. A sudden rise in the price of rice could turn subsistence into starvation for millions. The rural economy was further weakened by the absence of infrastructure capable of absorbing shocks. Irrigation, though present in parts of western India, remained limited in Bengal, where cultivation depended almost entirely on monsoon rainfall. Roads were poor and railways, though extensive, were built to move raw materials, jute, tea, coal, toward Calcutta and the ports, rather than to carry food between districts. This made the circulation of grain uneven. A surplus in one area could not easily relieve scarcity in another, and local shortages quickly escalated into regional crises. Bengal's urban centers drew heavily upon this fragile rural system. Calcutta, the capital of British India until 1911 and still its premier commercial hub, housed more than 2 million people. The city consumed vast quantities of rice each year, and its merchants played a decisive role in setting prices across the province. Jute mills, dockyards, and factories employed tens of thousands of laborers who relied on cheap grain to survive. The city's demand, enforced by wealth and political influence, often diverted food from the countryside to urban markets, tightening scarcity in rural districts even when total production was adequate. The social structure mirrored these economic imbalances. Landlords and wealthy traders accumulated wealth through rents, taxes, and speculation, while the majority of cultivators lived close to subsistence. Famines in the 19th century had already revealed these disparities. In 1770, during the early decades of company rule, Bengal lost perhaps a third of its population to famine, while later crises in 1866 and 1873 underlined the vulnerability of eastern India to food shortages. Though relief efforts gradually improved after the late 19th century, they remained tied to imperial priorities. Public works, test kitchens, and grain imports were introduced selectively, and the burden of financing relief often fell back on provincial governments with limited means. Bengal entered the 20th century with a reputation for agricultural fertility, but also with a long history of recurring hunger. By the interwar period, population growth placed further strain on resources. Bengal's population rose by nearly 10 million between 1921 and 1941, but agricultural yields did not keep pace. The pressure on land increased, and subdivision of holdings left many peasants cultivating barely an acre. Labor migration offered few outlets, as industry remained concentrated in Calcutta and its hinterland. Many rural households survived by seasonal work, moving between planting, harvesting, and occasional employment in towns. But this mobility could not compensate for structural poverty. The colonial administration measured Bengal's output in terms of revenue and exports rather than food security. Jute, grown in large tracts of eastern Bengal, fed the mills of Dundee and Calcutta, generating profits even in years when food was scarce. Tea from Assam, coal from Bihar, and manufactured goods from Bengal's factories flowed through Calcutta's port, binding the province into global trade networks. Yet the same infrastructure that enabled exports often did little to stabilize the rice supply for ordinary cultivators. Agricultural policy favored cash crops and revenue streams, leaving food production vulnerable to shifts in climate and trade. When war broke out in 1939, these structural weaknesses remained unresolved. Bengal was fertile, but its prosperity was brittle. Millions lived perpetually in debt, dependent on a single crop, exposed to fluctuations in price, and unable to build reserves against disaster. The dense population, limited diversification, and fragile networks of distribution created conditions in which disruption could rapidly escalate. For the imperial government, Bengal was a vital region, its resources essential to the war effort, its labor-feeding industries that supplied the empire's armies. Yet within the province itself, the majority of people lived close to the edge, with no margin for error. As the 1940s opened, the pressure of war began to push harder against this fragile equilibrium. Imports that once supplemented the province's diet were diverted. Shipping was requisitioned for military needs, and new demands were imposed on agriculture. The balance that had kept Bengal precariously stable for decades began to strain under the weight of global conflict, exposing vulnerabilities that had always lain beneath the surface. The outbreak of war in 1939 transformed India into a reservoir of resources for Britain's struggle against the Axis powers. From the first months of conflict, the colonial state reorganized its priorities toward the demands of the battlefield. Bengal, positioned at the heart of eastern India, became a critical supplier of food, labor, and raw materials. For the peasantry and working poor, this reallocation of resources brought new pressures that destabilized everyday survival. The shift was immediate. Britain declared India a participant in the war without consulting Indian political leaders, drawing on its population and economy as though they were extensions of the metropole. Across the subcontinent, taxes were raised, military recruitment intensified, and industries converted to war production. Bengal's jute mills expanded output to manufacture gunny bags for transporting grain and supplies to allied armies. The demand for coal from Bihar's mines rose sharply, while Calcutta's dockyards became crucial in servicing naval vessels. The influx of government contracts and military expenditure concentrated wealth in urban centers, but it also pulled grain, transport, and credit away from rural markets. Inflation followed quickly. The financing of war through heavy government borrowing pushed up prices across India, while procurement for the military absorbed a growing share of the food supply. Between 1939 and 1942, the price of rice nearly doubled in Bengal, outpacing the ability of laborers and cultivators to purchase it. Wages in agriculture and industry failed to rise in proportion, leaving the working poor with diminished purchasing power. The pressure was compounded by the rationing system introduced in Calcutta to ensure steady supplies for industrial laborers and government employees. While the city's population received controlled prices, rural districts were left to the mercy of the market, where scarcity drove costs beyond the reach of most households. The strategic situation in Asia deepened Bengal's vulnerability. Japan's entry into the war in December 1941 transformed the eastern frontier into a potential battlefield. Within weeks, Japanese forces advanced through Malaya and seized Singapore, dealing a blow to British prestige. The invasion of Burma in early 1942 carried the threat directly to India's border. For Bengal, the consequences were immediate. Burma had long supplied between 15 and 20% of India's rice imports, and its loss deprived Bengal of a critical buffer against poor harvests. Shipping routes across the Bay of Bengal, once busy with rice convoys, fell silent as the Japanese Navy extended its reach. Fear of invasion gripped the colonial administration. Calcutta, with its docks and industries, lay exposed on the coast, vulnerable to Japanese air raids. The retreat from Burma brought hundreds of thousands of soldiers and refugees into eastern India, placing additional strain on scarce food and accommodation. Military installations multiplied across Bengal, as airfields were constructed, supply depots expanded, and transport commandeered for the movement of troops. These preparations consumed resources that might otherwise have stabilized food distribution, leaving civilian markets neglected. The reallocation of transport was especially damaging. Bengal's railways and riverboats had long been the arteries of its food economy, moving rice from surplus districts to deficit regions and carrying imports inland from Calcutta. Wartime priorities diverted these networks to serve the army. Coal shipments, military equipment, and troop movements received precedence over grain. In practice, this meant that rice could no longer circulate as freely across the province. Local shortages became more severe because grain remained trapped in districts unable to move their stocks to where they were most needed. The wartime economy also accelerated social disparities. Those with access to contracts, credit, or storage facilities prospered, while the majority sank deeper into insecurity. Merchants in Calcutta, supported by military demand and government rationing schemes, accumulated profits. Landlords and moneylenders extracted rents and repayments in cash even as their tenants struggled to buy food. The colonial government, preoccupied with military survival, did little to restrain profiteering. Inflation was officially acknowledged, but measures to regulate prices or expand distribution were weak and inconsistent. The human consequences appeared first in the countryside. Agricultural laborers, who depended on wages to buy rice, saw their earnings devalued by rising prices. Sharecroppers who harvested small plots could not retain enough grain for their families after rents were paid. Families accustomed to seasonal hardship during the lean months now faced shortages throughout the year. Malnutrition spread silently, weakening resistance to disease and reducing the capacity for work. By 1942, reports of hunger-related deaths had begun to circulate in eastern districts, though officials often dismissed them as isolated or exaggerated. Meanwhile, Bengal's political landscape was strained by the war. The Indian National Congress, led by figures such as Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, opposed unconditional support for Britain without a commitment to independence. The Quit India movement of 1942 demanded British withdrawal, leading to mass protests and repression across the subcontinent. In Bengal, these tensions compounded the pressures of scarcity. The Muslim League, which dominated provincial politics, sought to consolidate its influence by presenting itself as the defender of Bengal's interests, yet it remained tied to the framework of colonial governance. Political energy was absorbed by questions of sovereignty and representation, leaving the day-to-day crisis of food supply inadequately addressed. The military emergency continued to drive decisions. The Japanese advance into Burma brought Bengal's eastern districts into the zone of potential conflict. The fall of Rangoon in March 1942 cut India off from vital rice imports, while Japanese bombing raids on Chittagong and air alerts in Calcutta heightened anxiety. In response, the colonial authorities initiated measures to deny the Japanese any resources should they invade. These measures, designed in London and Delhi and implemented in Bengal, would have profound consequences for the province's already fragile food system. As 1942 progressed, Bengal carried the full weight of both global conflict and local scarcity. Its fields remained fertile, yet its markets were destabilized by war finance, lost imports, and disrupted distribution. The province stood as both a critical base for Allied operations and a society whose subsistence was increasingly undermined by the demands of empire. Into this tense and unstable environment, new policies were about to be imposed that would deepen rather than alleviate the crisis. The Japanese conquest of Burma in early 1942 left British officials convinced that Bengal lay in imminent danger of invasion. Calcutta, with its shipyards, oil storage, and railway hubs, appeared vulnerable to air raids and amphibious assault. To imperial planners, the prospect of Japanese forces advancing across the Arakan coast or seizing control of Bengal's waterways demanded preventive action. Within this climate of fear, the colonial administration introduced what became known as the denial policy. It was not designed to relieve civilians, but to deny potential invaders the resources that might sustain them. The policy had two principal components: the removal of boats and the confiscation or destruction of surplus rice in coastal Bengal. Together, these measures aimed to create a scorched zone that would prevent the Japanese from exploiting local transport or provisions should they reach the province. In practice, they disrupted the foundations of Bengal's food economy. Boats were central to life in Bengal. The province's landscape of rivers and estuaries meant that for millions of people, boats were the only reliable means of travel and trade. Grain moved from villages to markets by river. Fish were caught and transported along waterways, and ferry services linked scattered communities to towns. When the denial policy was implemented in 1942, colonial authorities ordered the requisition, confiscation, or destruction of tens of thousands of boats capable of carrying more than 10 passengers or a certain weight of cargo. The rationale was military. These vessels could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. Yet the immediate effect was to sever communities from their markets and paralyze the distribution of food. In districts such as Midnapore, Noakhali, and Chittagong, cultivators suddenly found themselves unable to move rice from surplus villages to deficit areas. Fishermen were deprived of their livelihoods, and ordinary people lost access to ferry routes that had connected them for generations. Alongside the boat seizures, officials targeted rice stocks. The colonial administration ordered the removal or destruction of what it classified as surplus grain in areas deemed vulnerable to invasion. Local officers, acting under pressure to meet quotas, often seized rice indiscriminately. In theory, compensation was promised, but payments were slow and inadequate. In some cases, grain was simply burned or left to rot. The immediate result was to reduce the reserves available for local consumption. For small cultivators who relied on storing modest quantities of rice after harvest, the loss could mean the difference between subsistence and hunger. The denial policy was implemented unevenly across districts, but wherever it was applied, it disrupted traditional exchange networks. Bengal's food system had never been self-sufficient at the local level. It relied on constant movement between regions of surplus and scarcity. Removing boats and confiscating grain dismantled these fragile connections. Shortages that might once have been offset by trade now became acute crises within particular districts. Markets emptied of rice, and prices began to climb further. Colonial records from the period reveal the discontent the policy provoked. District officers reported hostility from villagers whose boats were seized without adequate explanation. Merchants complained that their stocks had been confiscated without regard for commercial obligations. Local politicians denounced the measures as destructive to both livelihood and morale. Yet the policy continued through 1942, driven by military priorities and fear of invasion rather than assessment of civilian consequences. For the British government, the denial policy was one more measure in a global strategy of wartime denial. Similar approaches were taken in Malaya and Burma. But Bengal's dependence on river transport and rice distribution made the province uniquely vulnerable. The withdrawal of boats and grain cut into the very mechanics of subsistence. Once disrupted, these systems could not easily be restored. Even after the Japanese advance stalled in Burma and the immediate danger receded, the confiscated boats were not returned in sufficient numbers, and the destroyed grain could not be replaced. The scars of the policy lingered across districts that had once been marginally secure, but now slid into acute scarcity. The psychological effect of the policy was also significant. Rural communities interpreted the destruction of boats and rice not as protection, but as abandonment. Many believed that the colonial government valued military calculation over civilian survival. Rumors circulated that Britain intended to sacrifice Bengal to preserve its strongholds further west. Such perceptions eroded confidence in the administration's capacity or willingness to provide relief when shortages deepened. The sense of betrayal spread through both Hindu and Muslim communities, feeding resentment that became politically consequential in the years that followed. The denial policy also created opportunities for speculation. With grain removed from open circulation, merchants who retained stocks could manipulate prices more effectively. Scarcity increased their bargaining power, and hoarding became more profitable. Markets in Calcutta grew increasingly dependent on supplies brought by rail under government control, further concentrating influence in the hands of urban traders. Rural populations, deprived of boats and stocks, were left exposed to fluctuations they could neither predict nor manage. By late 1942, reports of hunger were growing more frequent in districts affected by denial. Villagers who had lost their boats could not bring produce to market, reducing incomes just as food prices climbed. Families sold jewelry, land, and tools to buy rice, undermining their ability to recover in future seasons. Local administrators warned that the measures, far from deterring invasion, were undermining morale and stability. Yet the policy continued into 1943, sustained by inertia and the persistence of military fears. The wartime priorities of empire had set in motion a policy that dismantled the province's ability to feed itself. As scarcity spread and confidence in relief collapsed, the vulnerability of Bengal's rural majority grew sharper with each passing month. Into this fragile environment came new blows from nature, compounding human decisions with environmental shocks that stripped away the last remaining buffers against hunger. The fragile structure of Bengal's food system, already strained by wartime policies and disrupted trade, encountered a severe agricultural blow in 1942. In October of that year, a cyclone struck the coastal districts of Midnapore and 24 Parganas. Torrential rain and storm surges destroyed homes, breached embankments, and inundated fields at the very point when the almond rice crop, the main harvest of the year, was nearing maturity. Large tracts of cultivated land were submerged under salt water, leaving crops ruined and soil damaged. The cyclone also tore through storage houses, scattering grain and leaving it exposed to rot. Tens of thousands of cattle, vital for plowing and transport, were lost in the storm, reducing the capacity of farmers to prepare fields for the next planting season. The cyclone was followed by another calamity, a fungal disease known as brown spot, which attacked rice plants across the province. The disease spread rapidly in the damp conditions of late 1942, blackening leaves and reducing yields by as much as half in the affected areas. Scientists of the time lacked both the means and the urgency to combat the outbreak on a wide scale, and cultivators had no defenses against the sudden collapse of their fields. For many districts, particularly in the southern delta, the combination of cyclone damage and fungal infestation meant that the almond harvest of 1942 was far below normal levels. Agricultural statistics compiled by colonial officials suggest that Bengal's rice output in 1942 fell by between 20 and 25% compared to previous years. Such figures may appear modest at a distance, but in a province where millions lived at the margin of subsistence, even a reduction of 1/10 could provoke widespread scarcity. With the loss of Burma's imports earlier that same year, the diminished harvest left no reserve to offset the shortfall. The prices of rice began to climb with unprecedented speed. Grain markets reflected this tightening supply. In early 1942, before the cyclone, the price of rice had already been rising under the pressure of inflation and wartime procurement. By the beginning of 1943, the average price had more than doubled from its pre-war level. In Calcutta, merchants demanded sums for a maund of rice that exceeded the capacity of industrial workers to pay on their stagnant wages. In rural markets, the situation was worse. Cultivators who had lost crops or cattle were forced to purchase food at inflated rates, selling land, tools, or labor to secure even small quantities. The inflation was not uniform. Districts with better harvests or stronger merchant networks managed slightly lower prices. But the overall trend was upward and accelerating. The collapse of the almond harvest also reduced the availability of seed for the following season. Farmers who might have replanted were forced to consume their seed grain in order to survive. This decision, rational in the short term, further constrained future output. The damage to cattle stocks from the cyclone compounded the difficulty, leaving households without the means to plow or transport even if conditions improved. The food economy entered a downward spiral in which each failed harvest reduced the capacity of cultivators to prepare for the next. The provincial administration was slow to recognize the scale of the disaster. Reports from district officers mentioned shortages, but the wartime government in Calcutta focused on the risk of unrest rather than the immediate needs of cultivators. Relief measures were sporadic, and compensation for storm damage reached only a fraction of those affected. The destruction of embankments and salinization of fields in coastal districts went largely unaddressed, leaving farmland unusable for subsequent planting seasons. The neglect deepened the vulnerability of communities already weakened by the denial policy and disrupted markets. The scarcity of rice did not simply affect rural households. In Calcutta, demand surged as refugees and laborers poured into the city seeking work or safety from coastal districts. The influx placed further strain on urban food supplies, forcing authorities to increase allocations through the rationing system. While government employees and industrial workers received some protection through subsidized rations, the swelling population of the urban poor was left exposed. Families migrating from the countryside found that even in the metropolis, rice could not be purchased in sufficient quantity. Hunger began to spread across the social fabric, cutting through both village and city life. Merchants responded to scarcity by raising prices and withholding stocks, anticipating greater profits as supplies dwindled. The absence of effective regulation encouraged hoarding. Those with storage capacity could manipulate markets by releasing grain selectively, creating artificial shortages even in districts where the harvest had been less severely affected. The government's procurement schemes, already strained by the need to supply the military, failed to stabilize distribution. Instead, the flow of grain tilted toward strategic centers, leaving peripheral regions to fend for themselves. The combination of natural disaster, crop disease, and wartime disruption created a situation without precedent in recent memory. Older villagers recalled previous scarcities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but the speed of price rises and the absence of imports in 1942 to 43 made the crisis distinctive. Communities that had endured lean seasons before now found themselves unable to purchase rice at any price. The collapse of local resilience was visible in the small decisions of daily survival. Families eating wild plants, selling cattle for a fraction of their value, pawning household goods, or sending children to beg in nearby towns. The crisis also revealed the widening gulf between official perception and rural reality. While cultivators faced immediate hunger, many colonial reports continued to frame the shortage as a problem of distribution rather than production. Officials debated whether the harvest loss was severe enough to warrant major intervention, while prices on the ground climbed beyond reach. The administrative hesitation allowed the situation to deteriorate month by month, deepening the exposure of the poor to hunger and debt. By the spring of 1943, the province stood on the brink of disaster. The ruined Oman harvest had reduced supplies, the loss of Burma had eliminated imports, and inflation had already eroded purchasing power. Merchants controlled stocks, transport networks remained disrupted, and cultivators lacked seed, cattle, and reserves. Hunger, once sporadic, began to spread more systematically across districts, preparing the ground for behaviors that would soon transform scarcity into famine. As the shortfalls of the 1942 harvest became visible, Bengal's markets entered a new phase marked not only by scarcity, but by fear. Prices that had already risen steeply now began to move in unpredictable surges. Villagers arriving at weekly markets found that grain cost more in the afternoon than it had in the morning, and merchants adjusted rates daily in anticipation of further shortages. This volatility fed a sense of panic. Families who could afford to buy rice rushed to purchase as much as possible, emptying stalls and carrying home sacks that under normal circumstances would have been spread across weeks of consumption. The better-off cultivators and urban middle classes turned to hoarding as a rational defense against insecurity. The memory of earlier scarcities, combined with rumors of further crop failures, convinced many that supplies would vanish altogether. In Calcutta, households with storage space filled their courtyards with rice bags, purchasing far beyond their immediate needs. Traders and landlords followed the same logic on a larger scale, withdrawing grain from open sale to preserve their stocks for future profit. With each bag removed from circulation, scarcity grew sharper for those without reserves, accelerating the inflation that had already destabilized the market. The circulation of information, or often misinformation, deepened the crisis. Newspapers carried reports of shortages, while travelers spread stories of hunger in neighboring districts. In a society where transport had been curtailed and official communication distrusted, rumors gained unusual authority. News of an approaching scarcity could spark a wave of buying that emptied a district's markets within days. The behavior reinforced itself. The more people hoarded, the more prices rose, and the higher the incentive for others to follow. Black markets thrived in this climate. Merchants who controlled warehouses or had access to transport networks realized they could earn greater profits by withholding rice from the legal markets and selling secretly at inflated rates. In Calcutta, clandestine transactions took place in alleyways near Borabjar, while in rural districts grain was moved at night to avoid detection. These transactions became increasingly organized, with middlemen connecting merchants, landlords, and speculators who dealt outside official channels. Prices in the black market often reached double those in regulated shops, yet desperate families paid whatever was demanded. The colonial administration attempted to curb these practices through price controls, but enforcement was weak. Inspectors lacked the manpower to monitor vast rural areas, and many local officials were compromised by ties to landholders or traders. When prosecutions did occur, fines were minimal compared to the profits that could be made from illicit sales. As a result, the regulations had little deterrent effect. Instead, they often pushed merchants further into the shadows, reducing the amount of grain available in official markets and forcing consumers into clandestine channels. The disparity between classes grew sharper with every passing month. Landlords, wealthy cultivators, and urban professionals who could afford to purchase and store grain insulated themselves from hunger. They transformed their homes into warehouses, sometimes distributing rice to clients or dependents in exchange for political loyalty or labor. Meanwhile, the majority of smallholders and laborers, who lived from one wage or harvest to the next, had no capacity to hoard. They watched as grain disappeared from stalls and prices rose beyond their reach, with no reserve to fall back upon. The fear of shortage extended beyond rice. Edible oils, salt, and pulses also became objects of hoarding, and shortages spread into urban kitchens. The pressure on rice remained central, however, because it determined survival. Industrial workers in Calcutta demanded higher wages to match the inflated prices, leading to strikes and unrest that threatened wartime production. Employers resisted these demands, while government officials tried to maintain calm with assurances that supplies would stabilize. Such promises carried little credibility in neighborhoods where families were already reducing meals or mixing rice with wild greens to extend rations. Hoarding also intersected with religious and social divisions. In districts with mixed populations, communities competed for scarce stocks, sometimes accusing each other of monopolizing supplies. Hindu and Muslim traders were both accused of exploiting shortages, and political rhetoric increasingly framed access to food as a test of loyalty or betrayal. Though the famine was not born of communal conflict, scarcity provided fertile ground for suspicion, which local politicians sometimes exploited to strengthen their own constituencies. The absence of trust in the government's capacity to provide relief magnified the spiral of hoarding. Many families remembered the cyclone of 1942, when official aid had arrived too late or not at all, and assumed that no assistance would be forthcoming in the present crisis. This expectation encouraged them to rely solely on their own reserves, deepening the impulse to withdraw grain from circulation. The government's reputation for indifference, compounded by the denial policy's earlier confiscations, meant that official announcements carried little weight compared to local rumor or personal observation of empty markets. The effects of hoarding became visible not only in prices, but in the physical movement of people. Villagers who could not purchase rice in their local markets began to walk to larger towns in search of food, only to find shortages there as well. Calcutta absorbed the greatest influx, with thousands arriving daily in the hope of finding affordable grain. The city's streets grew increasingly crowded with migrants carrying baskets, sacks, or even small children in their arms, searching for shops that might still sell rice. Urban authorities, faced with the swelling population, struggled to maintain ration supplies for established residents, let alone for new arrivals. The market distortions of 1943 carried a logic of their own. Once hoarding became widespread, it was nearly impossible to reverse. Even if new grain entered the market, merchants and households preferred to keep it in storage, anticipating further scarcity. This created a self-perpetuating cycle in which availability shrank and prices rose, regardless of actual production levels. For those with capital, it was a period of immense profit. For the poor, it was the moment when scarcity began to turn into visible hunger. As meals were cut, wages could not cover food costs, and the streets bore witness to bodies weakened by want. As the summer of 1943 advanced, the pressures of panic and speculation reached into every district. Villages emptied, markets fractured, and the countryside began to send its starving into the cities. The streets of Calcutta, already burdened by wartime disruption, now became the stage on which the full collapse of Bengal's food system unfolded, with consequences that spread far beyond the initial act of hoarding. By mid-1943, the famine was no longer confined to market stalls and price tables. It had penetrated the fabric of Bengal's villages, dismantling the bonds of community and economy that had sustained rural life for centuries. The shortage of rice forced households into desperate measures. Families sold possessions accumulated over generations: brass utensils, wedding jewelry, heirloom cloth. These sales provided only brief relief, for prices continued to climb faster than the value of what could be pawned or sold. Once ornaments and household goods were gone, cultivators began to part with the very instruments of their survival. Plows, cattle, and seed were exchanged for small amounts of rice. The loss of cattle was especially crippling, since they were essential not only for tilling fields but also for transporting goods to market. Without them, fields lay fallow and mobility contracted. In some districts, the disappearance of livestock left villages silent, with fields untended and paths deserted. The cycle of agricultural production that had once promised renewal each season was broken piece by piece, leaving families dependent entirely on the possibility of purchasing food they could no longer afford. Land itself became a commodity of desperation. Smallholders sold or mortgaged their plots to landlords and moneylenders in exchange for grain or cash to buy it. These transfers of property reshaped the countryside within months. Families who had once owned modest holdings found themselves reduced to landless laborers, working for those who had acquired their fields at distressed prices. The concentration of land deepened existing inequalities and left the poor more dependent on wages precisely when agricultural employment collapsed. The strain was visible in the composition of rural households. Parents who could no longer feed their children sent them to Calcutta or other towns in the hope that they might find work or charity. Some were given into service in wealthier homes. Others were abandoned near temples, stations, or relief kitchens. Contemporary reports described children too weak to walk, carried by older siblings along roads that had become corridors of migration. In extreme cases, children were sold outright for a few kilograms of rice, transactions recorded in police files that testify to the breakdown of family bonds under starvation. Entire villages began to empty. When local markets failed and landlords offered no relief, households left en masse, joining streams of migrants moving toward towns or railway lines. The scale of this movement was unprecedented. District officers described thousands walking along the roads each day, carrying bundles on their heads and infants in their arms, searching for food or employment. Some reached Calcutta. Many collapsed before arrival, their bodies left by the roadside or hastily buried in shallow graves. Within the villages that remained occupied, death altered the rhythm of life. The shortage of fuelwood meant that cremations gave way to burials, often hurried and unmarked. Families too weak to dig graves left bodies exposed, attracting dogs and vultures. Epidemics of cholera and dysentery spread quickly among populations weakened by hunger, further accelerating mortality. The presence of disease made landlords and moneylenders less willing to offer credit or aid, fearing contagion. Communities already fractured by hunger were now isolated by fear of infection. The social order that had long shaped rural Bengal faltered under these conditions. Traditional patron-client relationships, in which landlords provided grain loans or employment in exchange for loyalty, dissolved when landlords themselves withdrew into guarded houses, unwilling to share their stores. The authority of village elders diminished as they could not prevent the flight of families or the sale of communal resources. Religious institutions offered some relief through alms and kitchens, but their resources were quickly overwhelmed by the scale of need. The migration to Calcutta intensified as the countryside emptied. For many, the city represented the last possibility of survival. Its streets filled with streams of arrivals, many skeletal from weeks of inadequate food. Pavements, railway platforms, and temple courtyards became makeshift shelters for families who had sold everything to reach the metropolis. Begging became the only recourse for those without connections or work. Calcutta residents, themselves under rationing, encountered the sight of starving villagers at every intersection. Mothers cradling infants too weak to cry, children with distended bellies lying in the dust, men collapsed beside tram lines. The police and municipal authorities struggled to manage the influx. Reports from 1943 describe bodies collected from the streets each morning, carted away before the business day began. Charitable organizations opened kitchens, but the numbers far exceeded their capacity. Some relief was provided by religious groups and private donors, yet corruption and inefficiency limited its reach. For each person who received a bowl of rice or gruel, many more were turned away. The collapse of rural Bengal also altered patterns of labor. Agricultural tasks that once relied on seasonal workers were left undone, as laborers either perished or migrated. Landlords who had acquired property through distressed sales found themselves without cultivators to work their new holdings. The fabric of production had been torn so completely that even potential surpluses could not be realized. This deepened the scarcity further, since unused fields translated into smaller harvests in subsequent seasons. Accounts from district officers reveal the psychological disintegration that accompanied material collapse. Villagers spoke of hopelessness, of a conviction that no harvest or relief would arrive in time. Reports mentioned suicides by cultivators who had lost their families, as well as outbreaks of theft and banditry by those who sought to seize grain or cattle from neighbors. In some areas, communal tensions flared as groups competed for the few remaining stocks. Hunger stripped away the norms of cooperation that had once bound villages together. By late 1943, Bengal's countryside had become a landscape of hollowed villages, abandoned fields, and processions of migrants heading toward urban centers. The fragile balance of subsistence that had persisted through previous crises was gone. What remained was a province where rural society itself was dissolving, and where the capital became the stage for the visible presence of famine. With Calcutta overflowing with the destitute, the British government could no longer ignore the human disaster spreading under its administration. Yet its response remained constrained by priorities that placed the war effort above civilian relief. By the second half of 1943, the scale of suffering in Bengal could no longer be concealed. The streets of Calcutta bore witness to starvation on a scale that disturbed even officials accustomed to scarcity in colonial India. Yet the response of the British administration was hesitant, fragmented, and shaped above all by the imperatives of war. Relief was requested, debated, and delayed, with outcomes that fell far short of the need. Within Bengal, the provincial government lacked the resources to address the catastrophe. The premiership of Fazlul Huq had collapsed in 1943, and Khwaja Natsimuddin, who assumed office, presided over an administration constrained by limited revenues and divided political loyalties. Provincial coffers were already drained by wartime inflation and requisitions, leaving little capacity to purchase grain at inflated prices. The bureaucracy, overstretched and compromised by corruption, proved unable to enforce price controls or manage distribution effectively. Reports from district magistrates painted a bleak picture of markets stripped bare, yet their appeals for emergency supplies met with little action beyond paper directives. The new viceroy, Field Marshal Archibald Wavell, appointed in October 1943, quickly recognized that the crisis demanded large-scale intervention. Wavell appealed directly to London, requesting shipments of grain to stabilize Bengal's markets. His correspondence described the famine as a disaster that threatened both morale and imperial authority. Yet his appeals collided with the priorities of Winston Churchill's war cabinet, which was determined to allocate shipping and grain primarily to sustain military campaigns in Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Britain itself remained under rationing, and officials in London argued that diversion of supplies to India would undermine the war effort elsewhere. The shortage of shipping became the principal justification for inaction. The Battle of the Atlantic, in which German U-boats targeted Allied convoys, made transport capacity one of the war's scarcest resources. Churchill's advisors insisted that tonnage must be reserved for armaments and supplies to Britain and its allies, while ships did continue to carry grain across oceans, to sustain stockpiles in the Mediterranean, to support Allied forces in North Africa, and to feed liberated populations in Europe. India's requests were consistently relegated to lower priority. At the same time, the Indian Army was expanding rapidly, with over 2 million men under arms by 1943. Feeding this force required substantial supplies, much of which were procured within India itself. Grain reserves were directed toward army depots to ensure uninterrupted rations for soldiers, leaving civilians to compete for what remained in the open market. The logic of total war meant that civilian suffering in Bengal was treated as secondary to maintaining military strength across multiple fronts. In London, debate within the cabinet reflected both strategic calculation and prejudice. Churchill, whose hostility toward Indian nationalism was well known, expressed little sympathy for Bengal's plight. Minutes from cabinet meetings reveal his resistance to shipping diversions, even when officials such as Leopold Amery, the Secretary of State for India, pressed for relief. At one point, Churchill questioned why Indians should be protected from famine when Britain itself was under strain, and he made remarks attributing shortages to overpopulation rather than policy. Such attitudes colored the entire process of decision-making, reducing the urgency of Bengal's requests. The result was that aid, when it arrived, was both minimal and late. In the latter half of 1943, small consignments of wheat and rice were dispatched from Australia, but these shipments were measured in hundreds of thousands of tons, rather than the millions required to restore stability. The deliveries were delayed by months of debate and bureaucratic obstruction, reaching Bengal only after mortality had already climbed sharply. Relief kitchens were opened, but they fed only a fraction of the starving population, and corruption in distribution siphoned supplies away from those most in need. Within India, the crisis revealed the tension between central and provincial authority. The government of India in Delhi, dominated by imperial officials, argued that Bengal bore responsibility for its own food security, while Bengal's leaders countered that the province could not procure grain when transport and trade were under central control. This dispute paralyzed effective coordination. Provinces with surplus stocks, such as Punjab, resisted compulsory transfers, fearing shortages of their own. Negotiations dragged on while Bengal's markets continued to empty. The failure to mobilize grain from other Indian provinces reflected both logistical and political barriers. Railways and riverboats remained diverted to military needs, limiting the capacity to move large quantities of food across long distances. At the same time, communal and regional rivalries discouraged cooperation. Politicians in surplus regions argued that Bengal's mismanagement had caused its crisis and resisted sending grain that might leave their own populations vulnerable. The colonial administration, unwilling to risk unrest in Punjab or the United Provinces, did not compel large transfers. Meanwhile, reports from Calcutta grew increasingly graphic. Officials recorded thousands of deaths each week, bodies collected from pavements in the early hours to avoid disrupting the city's daily routines. Epidemics of cholera and malaria spread among those weakened by hunger. Photographs taken by journalists and missionaries circulated abroad, depicting skeletal figures lying in the streets. But these images were often censored within Britain, where the government sought to avoid criticism of its wartime policies. Archibald Wavell persisted in pressing for greater aid, but his authority was limited. He proposed a long-term food plan for India, including improved storage and transport, yet his initiatives were constrained by both London's control over resources and the ongoing demands of the war. The frustration was evident in his private diary, where he described the famine as a calamity worsened by official neglect. Yet even his efforts could not overcome the priorities of a government that placed victory in Europe above the survival of civilians in Bengal. By late 1943, the British government's response had revealed the hierarchy of imperial priorities. Relief was provided only in fragments, delayed until it could not avert mass mortality. The machinery of empire, vast in its reach and capacity, had shown itself unwilling to act decisively when the lives of millions of colonial subjects were at stake. And while London debated tonnage and allocations, Bengal's famine deepened, creating conditions that would draw international attention and intensify the controversy surrounding the highest levels of British leadership. The slow and inadequate response to Bengal's famine cannot be separated from the attitudes of Britain's highest leadership, and above all from the role of Winston Churchill and his wartime cabinet. The Prime Minister regarded India primarily through the prism of strategy, perceiving the subcontinent as a base for military operations rather than as a society of hundreds of millions requiring protection. His outlook, shaped by decades of imperial service and hostility toward Indian nationalism, conditioned how requests for aid were received in London. Churchill's correspondence with his advisors during 1943 illustrates this perspective. When reports of famine reached the cabinet, he was quick to deflect responsibility, attributing the crisis not to imperial policy, but to what he described as Indian breeding habits and poor administration. In conversations recorded by Secretary of State for India Leopold Amery, Churchill made remarks that shocked even colleagues accustomed to his brusque style, suggesting that famine relief would be wasted on a population that, in his view, multiplied beyond the land's capacity. Such statements, preserved in diaries and cabinet papers, revealed not only prejudice, but also a refusal to accept that British policy itself had intensified Bengal's vulnerability. Behind these comments lay a hard calculation of wartime priorities. Churchill insisted that every ship and every ton of grain be weighed against the demands of global strategy. Grain was diverted to build stockpiles in the Mediterranean and the Balkans in anticipation of Allied campaigns, while Australia, capable of supplying rice and wheat, was instructed to send much of its produce to the Middle East rather than to India. The decision reflected not only logistical considerations, but also the government's conviction that European theaters carried greater importance for the war's outcome than civilian survival in Asia. Leopold Amery, charged with representing Indian interests, pressed for more substantial relief. Along with Viceroy Wavell, he warned that famine undermined morale, fueled unrest, and tarnished Britain's global reputation at a time when it claimed to fight for freedom against fascism. Yet his arguments met resistance from Churchill, who dismissed calls for large shipments. Amery's frustration emerges clearly from his diary, where he compared Churchill's stance on India to that of Hitler's racial policies in Europe, an extraordinary remark that underscored the depth of disagreement within the cabinet. Shipping constraints were cited repeatedly as justification for inaction, but critics noted the selective nature of these constraints. While Bengal's requests languished, convoys continued to transport grain to build surpluses in Ceylon and to maintain reserves in the Middle East far beyond immediate needs. The Royal Navy's insistence on secure stockpiles for potential campaigns clashed with the desperate appeals of Bengal's administrators, who watched mortality rise while warehouses elsewhere remained filled. The controversy extended beyond Britain. American officials, monitoring conditions in India, expressed concern at the failure to provide relief. Reports from Calcutta reached Washington, where observers linked the famine to wider questions of colonial policy and self-determination. The Roosevelt administration raised the issue with London, urging that shipping be diverted to relieve Bengal. Churchill resisted, wary of setting a precedent that might compel further concessions to Indian demands for autonomy. The famine, in this sense, became entangled with the politics of empire at the highest diplomatic level. Within India, Churchill's reputation deteriorated rapidly. Nationalist leaders seized upon his dismissive remarks as evidence of imperial indifference. Gandhi and Nehru pointed to the famine as proof that Britain's rule brought not protection but exploitation. Even among loyalists and moderates, Churchill's refusal to divert meaningful aid was viewed as a betrayal. The contrast between the resources allocated to European civilians and the neglect of Bengal sharpened resentment across the political spectrum. Churchill's defenders later argued that he faced impossible choices, balancing the survival of Britain itself against the needs of distant provinces. Yet the archival record reveals that decisions were not merely about scarcity, but about priorities. The empire possessed the means to reduce Bengal's suffering. It chose not to employ them at sufficient scale. The Prime Minister's hostility toward Indian aspirations, combined with strategic calculation, shaped a response that allowed famine to deepen unchecked. The controversy also entered the public domain, though often in muted form. British newspapers, under wartime censorship, published only limited accounts of Bengal's crisis. Missionaries and relief workers who attempted to publicize the famine faced restrictions, while photographic evidence was suppressed from wider circulation. In contrast, Indian newspapers carried increasingly stark accounts, fueling anger among readers who contrasted the silence of London with the visibility of suffering on their own streets. The famine thus became not only a humanitarian disaster, but a political symbol. It crystallized doubts about the legitimacy of British rule at a time when the Empire sought to claim moral authority against fascism. The fact that Churchill personally resisted larger relief efforts added a layer of bitterness, reinforcing perceptions that the highest levels of government had deliberately subordinated Indian lives to imperial strategy. As 1943 gave way to 1944, these tensions sharpened. Mortality continued to rise, and reports from Calcutta grew more graphic, forcing the administration to expand relief belatedly. Yet the memory of earlier neglect could not be erased. The decisions taken in London and the remarks attributed to Churchill lingered in public consciousness, shaping both domestic Indian politics and international perceptions of empire. The debates within the cabinet and between Britain and its allies did not resolve the crisis. They exposed the hierarchy of values that determined who would receive aid and who would be left to starve. In Bengal, those calculations were felt in every empty marketplace, every abandoned village, and every body carried from the streets of Calcutta. And as relief began to trickle in, too late for millions, the machinery of distribution faced its own challenges: corruption, inefficiency, and the sheer impossibility of meeting need on such a vast scale. By the time grain shipments began to reach Bengal in late 1943, the famine had already consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. Relief, when it came, was piecemeal and constrained, shaped less by humanitarian urgency than by the limits imposed by bureaucracy, shipping availability, and political will. The scale of the crisis demanded millions of tons of food. What Bengal received were scattered consignments, fragmented programs, and initiatives marred by inefficiency and corruption. The first significant imports consisted of wheat from Australia, dispatched in small convoys across the Indian Ocean. These shipments faced long delays due to debates over priority at every stage, from allocation of shipping tonnage to unloading at Indian ports. By the time the grain arrived in Calcutta, the situation had already deteriorated far beyond the reach of what these consignments could repair. Wheat itself was an unfamiliar staple for much of Bengal's rural population, who depended overwhelmingly on rice. For many villagers, the distribution of wheat offered little practical relief, as they lacked the means to grind or cook it effectively. Urban populations adapted more readily, but the substitution did not address the broader collapse of Bengal's rice economy. Relief kitchens were established across Calcutta and in some rural districts. Administered by a patchwork of provincial authorities, charitable organizations, and religious institutions, these kitchens provided meals to thousands each day. Yet the numbers in need far outstripped capacity. Contemporary records estimate that by late 1943, between 2 and 3 million people in Bengal required daily feeding. The largest kitchens served tens of thousands, but most were small operations, feeding only a fraction of those who crowded outside their doors. Corruption further diminished the impact. Supplies were siphoned away by intermediaries, diluted in quantity or quality, and sold illegally at inflated rates. Those who lacked connections or the ability to bribe officials often found themselves excluded from access. The administrative machinery of relief was weak. Bengal's civil service, already stretched thin by wartime requisitions and shortages of trained personnel, struggled to monitor distribution. Many district officers were overwhelmed by the sheer number of starving migrants pouring into towns and villages. Records reveal instances in which officers requisitioned rice for relief only to see it diverted to military depots or seized by local merchants. The absence of a coherent central plan meant that relief varied drastically between districts. Some received modest kitchens and grain allocations, while others were left almost entirely to the mercy of private charity. Attempts to regulate prices and compel merchants to release stocks continued, but proved largely ineffective. Grain dealers adapted quickly, concealing supplies or selling them through black market networks. Officials who tried to enforce regulations faced intimidation or resistance, while others were complicit in the trade. Even as people starved in the streets, warehouses in parts of Calcutta held rice reserved for speculative profit. The disconnect between visible abundance in certain quarters and visible destitution on the pavements fed resentment and despair. Medical relief lagged even further behind. Starvation weakened immune systems, leaving populations vulnerable to cholera, malaria, and dysentery. Hospitals were inundated, yet lacked both medicines and staff. Relief efforts concentrated narrowly on food distribution, while the spread of disease claimed thousands of additional lives. Missionary records describe wards filled with emaciated bodies, many too weak to consume the food provided. The absence of integrated medical support meant that even where kitchens operated, mortality remained high. The famine's impact on rural districts exposed the limitations of centrally organized relief. Transport bottlenecks restricted the ability to move grain inland, and many areas remained inaccessible during the monsoon. Boats, seized earlier under the denial policy, had not been replaced, leaving rivers that once carried food flows silent. Villagers in isolated districts received nothing, even as urban centers attracted attention and supplies. The imbalance deepened rural depopulation, driving more families into Calcutta in the hope of survival. Local initiatives sometimes filled gaps left by official neglect. Hindu temples, Muslim charitable trusts, and Christian missions organized feeding programs, often relying on donations from urban elites who were disturbed by the sight of starvation outside their homes. These efforts, though sincere, were limited by resources. They could not match the need, and many collapsed after weeks of exhausting their supplies. The contrast between sporadic private charity and the absence of a coordinated imperial response underscored the perception that the colonial state had abdicated its responsibilities. Relief also became entangled in politics. The Muslim League, which held power in Bengal, sought to use kitchens and food allocations to consolidate support among its base, sometimes directing resources preferentially to loyal constituencies. Nationalist organizations, though suppressed by wartime restrictions, attempted to mobilize their own relief programs to demonstrate the failures of government. The provision of food became a tool of political rivalry, with the starving population caught between competing claims to authority. For those who survived long enough to reach relief kitchens, the rations were often meager. A ladle of rice gruel, perhaps with lentils if supplies permitted. Eyewitnesses described children fighting for scraps, women fainting in line, and officials turning away the weakest once the day's allocation was finished. The indignity of waiting for hours for a portion that could not sustain life added another layer of suffering. Many who received food one day died of weakness the next. The arrival of limited relief also created a cruel hierarchy of survival. Those with the strength to stand in line, the connections to secure access, or the proximity to functioning kitchens had a chance to endure. Those too weak to travel, too poor to bribe, or too distant from centers of distribution were left outside the circle of aid. This unevenness meant that mortality continued at staggering levels, even while official records pointed to the establishment of relief programs. By early 1944, mortality had peaked, but the devastation of famine could not be measured only in deaths. The collapse of households, the transfer of land, the orphaning of children, and the erosion of rural economies all left scars that relief efforts did little to address. What aid arrived preserved fragments of the population, but it could not reverse the disintegration of Bengal's society. And as the famine ground on, the human toll became impossible to ignore, pressing itself into the consciousness of those who walked Calcutta's streets or passed through Bengal's villages where silence now marked the absence of life. The famine's destruction was measured not only in statistics but in the transformation of Bengal's streets, villages, and households into landscapes of death. By late 1943, Calcutta had become a city overwhelmed by emaciated figures. Pavements were lined with men, women, and children too weak to stand, their bodies reduced to skin and bone, their eyes sunken, their movements lethargic. Contemporary photographs, smuggled past censors, show lines of skeletal children with distended bellies. Mothers crouched beside dying infants, and men collapsed beside tramlines while the city's daily traffic continued around them. Municipal records indicate that thousands of bodies were collected from the streets each week. Police carts moved through neighborhoods at dawn, gathering the dead before shopkeepers opened their shutters. Corpses were stacked on wagons and taken to mass burial sites or cremation grounds. The scale of mortality overwhelmed traditional rites. Families who once conducted elaborate funeral rituals found themselves unable to secure firewood, transport, or priests. Many dead were buried hastily without ceremony. Others were abandoned altogether. Dogs, crows, and vultures became constant presences around the outskirts of Calcutta, feeding on bodies left unattended. Disease spread rapidly through this weakened population. Starvation had eroded resistance to infection, and crowded conditions accelerated transmission. Cholera and dysentery swept through makeshift shelters where migrants huddled without clean water. Malaria, endemic in Bengal, became deadlier as malnourished bodies could not endure repeated fevers. Dysentery turned relief kitchens into centers of both sustenance and contagion, as large crowds gathered daily without sanitation. Contemporary medical officers noted that many deaths recorded as famine were in fact caused by infection, though the boundary was meaningless in practice. Hunger and disease acted together to claim lives. Families disintegrated under the pressure. Parents sold or abandoned children they could not feed. Reports from charitable organizations describe railway stations filled with children left behind by relatives who continued their journeys in search of food. Orphanages overflowed, unable to accommodate the numbers delivered by police or found wandering the streets. Many children were absorbed into networks of begging or exploitation, surviving in groups that roamed Calcutta in search of scraps. The rural toll was less visible, but no less severe. Villages where crops had failed and markets collapsed saw mortality rise steadily. Local officials recorded deserted hamlets where only a handful of survivors remained. In some areas, entire families perished together, leaving fields untended and homes empty. Survivors remembered silence descending on once bustling communities, broken only by the cries of hungry children or the wailing of widows. Where relief was absent, villagers turned to foraging for roots, leaves, and husks, often consuming plants that caused sickness. Cases of poisoning were recorded in medical reports, as people resorted to eating inedible or contaminated materials. The famine also exposed gendered patterns of suffering. Women, often responsible for distributing food within households, were among the first to reduce their intake to preserve portions for children or husbands. Pregnant women miscarried in large numbers, and maternal mortality soared. Observers noted women fainting in queues at relief kitchens, their strength depleted after months of giving priority to others. In some cases, women were forced into prostitution to secure grain, a pattern documented in police files and missionary reports alike. Hunger reshaped gender relations, compounding the vulnerability of women and girls who had little bargaining power in a collapsing society. The social disruption extended into labor patterns. Migrants who survived long enough to reach Calcutta frequently sought employment in jute mills or on the docks, but their physical weakness limited their productivity. Employers resisted hiring the emaciated, further marginalizing the starving population. Agricultural work in the countryside similarly declined, as laborers either died or migrated. This shortage of labor compounded the food crisis, leaving fields unplanted even when seed and rain were available. Relief efforts, however limited, created stark contrasts within the population. Those able to access kitchens or ration shops displayed some signs of recovery, while others, excluded or too weak to queue, wasted away. Eyewitnesses describe lines outside kitchens where the distinction between the living and the nearly dead blurred. People collapsed while waiting for food, their places in line filled by others who stepped over their bodies. Charitable workers recorded the daily experience of watching dozens perish at the gates, unable to survive long enough to receive a ladle of gruel. Mass mortality altered the atmosphere of the city. Calcutta's middle classes, initially insulated by rations and stored grain, found famine impossible to ignore. The sight of skeletal figures at every street corner intruded into daily routines, making denial difficult. Accounts from residents speak of the psychological weight of encountering death constantly, of being unable to walk to market or office without stepping past bodies. This omnipresence of famine forced even those not directly starving to confront the fragility of colonial governance and the reality of imperial neglect. Yet not all responses were sympathetic. Police records include cases of shopkeepers beating back starving crowds that gathered at their doors. Some landlords in rural districts fenced off their stored grain, guarded by hired men against desperate neighbors. Instances of violence, theft, and assault increased as hunger stripped away restraints. The famine exposed not only the limits of compassion, but also the harshness of survival under conditions where scarcity pitted communities against one another. For those who lived through 1943 and 1944, the famine left memories etched not only in loss but in the breakdown of ordinary life. Marriage rituals were postponed indefinitely, festivals went unobserved, and schools closed as children either migrated or succumbed. The cultural rhythms of Bengal, long tied to cycles of planting and harvest, were interrupted by absence and death. Survivors later recalled these years as a void in the life of the province, when the ordinary fabric of society dissolved under the weight of hunger. By 1944, mortality had begun to slow, but the scars of the famine remained visible everywhere. The countryside was littered with abandoned homes, Calcutta's streets still bore the presence of orphaned children, and fields across southern Bengal remained untilled. The famine's toll was not confined to those who died. Millions who survived carried the physical and psychological marks of starvation, displacement, and disease. These wounds reshaped how Bengalis viewed their rulers, and how the empire's legitimacy was contested in the years that followed. The famine unfolded not only as a humanitarian disaster, but also as a political turning point. In Bengal and across India, the catastrophe exposed the fragility of colonial authority and became a powerful weapon in the hands of those who sought to challenge British rule. While bodies lined the streets of Calcutta and villages emptied into silence, political leaders debated responsibility, legitimacy, and the meaning of empire in wartime. The Indian National Congress, though weakened by mass arrests after the Quit India movement of 1942, continued to condemn the famine from prisons and through its remaining networks. Gandhi, writing from detention, pointed to the famine as proof that foreign rule could not safeguard Indian lives. Nehru, in letters smuggled out of confinement, described the disaster as an indictment of imperial priorities that privileged armies and exports over the survival of ordinary cultivators. For Congress leaders, the famine was not simply a tragedy but a confirmation of their long-standing argument that India's destiny could not be entrusted to a government seated in London. Outside the prisons, Congress sympathizers circulated pamphlets and held clandestine meetings, portraying the famine as Britain's greatest failure in India since the rebellion of 1857. Local activists linked the famine to broader struggles for independence, drawing parallels between the hunger of 1943 and earlier famines under colonial rule. By connecting present suffering with a historical pattern of exploitation, they sought to strengthen the case for immediate self-rule. The famine also provided an opportunity for Subhas Chandra Bose and the Indian National Army, INA, operating from Southeast Asia with Japanese support. Bose, himself a Bengali, framed the famine as evidence that Britain had forfeited any claim to moral authority. Through radio broadcasts from Singapore and Rangoon, he appealed directly to Indians, denouncing Churchill's government for letting millions starve. His rhetoric resonated strongly in Bengal, where memories of hunger and images of skeletal bodies made such accusations undeniable. Recruitment to the INA drew strength from this climate, as young men saw in Bose's call not only the promise of liberation, but also a chance to avenge the suffering inflicted on their families and villages. The Muslim League, which governed Bengal at the provincial level, faced a more complex challenge. Khwaja Nazimuddin's administration struggled to balance loyalty to the colonial government with the growing discontent of his constituents. League leaders attempted to direct relief through their own networks, presenting themselves as protectors of Bengal's Muslims. Yet accusations of favoritism and corruption eroded credibility. Hindu villagers and Congress supporters alleged that League officials diverted grain and relief kitchens disproportionately toward Muslim communities. Whether or not such charges were always accurate, the perception deepened communal divides and weakened the League's broader legitimacy. At the same time, the famine politicized the urban middle classes in new ways. Intellectuals, writers, and journalists who witnessed starvation in Calcutta turned their pens into instruments of critique. The novelist Bibhutibhushan Bandyopadhyay and poet Bishnu De produced works that captured the despair of famine-stricken Bengal. The progressive cultural movement, aligned with the Communist Party of India, used theater, literature, and visual art to depict hunger and to mobilize urban audiences against both profiteers and imperial neglect. The Communist Party, having shifted its position after Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, supported the Allied war effort, but also sought to expose the social inequities magnified by famine. Relief campaigns organized by leftist groups demonstrated the potential of grassroots mobilization at a time when official channels failed. The press played a critical role despite censorship. While British authorities restricted the most graphic images from appearing in newspapers intended for British readers, Indian journals carried increasingly stark reports. Photographs by journalists such as Sunil Jana and Margaret Burke-White, though not always published immediately, circulated among intellectual circles and later reached international audiences. These images undermined the carefully maintained narrative of empire as a benevolent guardian. For readers in India, they confirmed what they saw daily, that the colonial state had lost both control and legitimacy. Internationally, the famine became an embarrassment for Britain. American journalists and officials, already uneasy with colonial policies, pointed to Bengal as evidence of the contradiction between Allied rhetoric of freedom and the reality of empire. Reports reached Washington and influenced debates within the Roosevelt administration, which pressed Britain to expand relief and consider political reforms. Though Churchill resisted, the pressure from an ally underscored how the famine had eroded Britain's standing on the global stage. In the countryside, famine reshaped local politics at a more immediate level. Peasants who had lost land and livestock turned against landlords who had failed to provide relief. Long-standing ties of loyalty dissolved as hunger severed the bonds of patronage. In some districts, armed bands emerged, raiding granaries or intercepting grain convoys. While not organized on a scale comparable to revolutionary movements, these acts reflected the desperation and anger of a population abandoned by both provincial and imperial authorities. The memory of famine also lingered in the minds of those who survived, shaping political attitudes in subsequent years. Survivors associated hunger with empire, recalling that while Britain directed ships and grain across the world, Bengal's villages starved. This association would fuel support for nationalist leaders in the final years before independence, when the question of legitimacy became decisive. By early 1944, the famine had not only killed millions, but had transformed Bengal's political landscape. The authority of the colonial state appeared hollow, its inability to prevent or relieve mass death plain to every observer. Nationalists, revolutionaries, and even international critics seized upon the catastrophe as proof of empire's bankruptcy. And while the famine continued to claim lives, British companies and military contracts prospered, widening the gap between those who suffered and those who profited from the machinery of war. While millions in Bengal sold land, tools, and even their children to secure a handful of rice, the machinery of empire continued to generate profit for those positioned within its structures. The famine coincided with a period of extraordinary wartime expansion for industries tied to the British war effort, and the contrast between prosperity and mass starvation became one of the defining features of 1943. Calcutta, the administrative and commercial hub of Bengal, stood at the center of this paradox. The city's jute mills, among the largest in the world, operated at full capacity to meet Allied demand for gunny bags used to transport food, ammunition, and military supplies across global battlefronts. Orders surged during the war years, and factory owners amassed unprecedented wealth. Profits were recorded in balance sheets while, outside the mill gates, skeletal laborers begged for food. Workers within the mills fared little better, as wages lagged far behind inflation. The sight of factories roaring with production against a backdrop of starving families underscored the disjunction between imperial priorities and human survival. Other industries also prospered. Engineering firms, steel foundries, and chemical plants in Bengal received contracts to produce military equipment, vehicles, and supplies. The docks of Calcutta, vital to the Allied presence in the Bay of Bengal, bustled with activity as troops and material passed through. Shipping companies secured lucrative freight contracts, charging high rates to move goods under government requisition. The flow of capital into these sectors enriched owners and merchants, who converted profits into real estate, securities, or durable goods. Wartime prosperity, however, remained confined to a narrow stratum, leaving the majority of workers and cultivators trapped in deepening misery. Agricultural speculation also flourished. Merchants who controlled storage facilities capitalized on shortages, holding back grain until prices reached extraordinary levels. District reports detail instances where warehouses stood full even as villagers perished outside. Hoarding became a rational business strategy, defended by traders as protection against uncertain future supplies. Profits from speculation were reinvested in land, further consolidating economic power in the hands of those who already possessed wealth. The famine, in this way, not only killed but also transformed property relations, redistributing land upward and embedding inequalities that persisted long after the crisis had passed. The disparity was especially stark in Bengal's urban society. Calcutta's elite families hosted dinners supplied with imported foods, while entire neighborhoods outside their compounds starved. Luxury goods, though scarce, were still available to those with resources. Contemporary observers noted the jarring contrast of cars delivering wealthy patrons to theaters and restaurants. Passing beggars collapsed on the pavement. The war economy allowed a minority to maintain lifestyles insulated from famine, reinforcing the perception that hunger was borne selectively by those without access to imperial or mercantile networks. British companies also profited directly. Firms tied to shipping, banking, and insurance recorded substantial gains as the war redirected resources through India. Imperial procurement guaranteed steady returns, with contracts insulated from market fluctuations. The presence of Allied forces in eastern India brought additional expenditure, as military bases and airfields created demand for supplies and services. Hotels, contractors, and middlemen in Calcutta benefited from this influx, further highlighting the gap between the economic vitality of certain sectors and the collapse of subsistence for the rural poor. The profits of war were not restricted to Europeans or large firms. Indian merchants, landlords, and intermediaries also participated. Many grew wealthy by acting as suppliers to the military or by engaging in speculative trade. Yet their enrichment did not diminish the sense of injustice. Rather, it underscored the structural character of the crisis. Famine became the condition of the many, profit the privilege of the few. The coexistence of booming contracts and mass starvation revealed the priorities of an economic order oriented toward empire rather than toward the welfare of its population. This divergence did not go unnoticed. Writers and journalists in Bengal exposed the scale of profiteering, contrasting balance sheets with the images of famine victims. Political leaders cited these contrasts in speeches and pamphlets, presenting famine not as an unavoidable calamity, but as evidence of a system that enriched a minority while sacrificing millions. The symbolism of war profits amid starvation deepened resentment toward both the colonial state and those Indians perceived as complicit in its operations. The unequal impact of the famine also reshaped social relations within villages. Landless laborers, already at the bottom of the hierarchy, bore the brunt of starvation. In contrast, moneylenders and traders who survived or prospered often expanded their holdings by acquiring land from desperate peasants. The famine, therefore, accelerated a process of dispossession, ensuring that recovery would be uneven long after the immediate crisis had passed. Survivors who had lost property or livestock faced futures of permanent dependence, while those who had exploited shortages emerged stronger. The moral dimension of profit during famine became a subject of bitter debate. Some merchants and industrialists defended their actions as necessary responses to market forces, while critics denounced them as profiteers. Religious leaders condemned hoarding and speculation, urging redistribution or charity, yet their appeals rarely altered business practices. The famine exposed not only the fragility of Bengal's food system, but also the absence of moral consensus on responsibility during catastrophe. The wartime state, aware of profiteering, attempted occasional interventions. Investigations into grain hoarding were launched, price controls were announced, and profiteers were denounced in official rhetoric. Yet enforcement remained weak, and many investigations ended without penalty. The machinery of regulation, compromised by corruption and bureaucratic inertia, proved incapable of restraining those who profited from scarcity. The spectacle of failed regulation reinforced the belief that the colonial government was either unwilling or unable to challenge the wealthy. By late 1944, the famine had created a society divided not only by survival, but by accumulation. On one side stood millions who had lost land, tools, family members, and hope. On the other stood a narrower group that had emerged wealthier than before, holding the titles to new properties, the profits of contracts, and the influence that came with economic power. The famine had deepened inequality to an extent that would shape Bengal's social and political life for years. And while profits accumulated in accounts and properties, the human landscape of famine continued to bear its imprint. Fields untilled, villages emptied, and families fragmented by hunger. By late 1944, conditions in Bengal began to shift, not through decisive policy, but through the gradual reappearance of food supplies and the return of more favorable harvests. After 2 years of scarcity, a sequence of agricultural and logistical changes combined to ease the worst pressures, even as the devastation left by the famine remained inscribed across the province. The almond harvest of late 1944 was markedly better than that of the preceding year. Weather conditions proved less destructive, fungal disease abated, and cultivators, though diminished in number and resources, managed to plant more extensively than during the height of the crisis. Reports from districts such as Burdwan and Nadia indicated yields approaching pre-war averages. though still uneven and hampered by the loss of cattle and seed reserves. The crop provided a measure of relief to rural households that had survived on wild foods, gruel, or charity. Simultaneously, the flow of imported grain increased. Allied victories in the Indian Ocean secured shipping lanes that had previously been threatened by Japanese naval activity. With the pressure of immediate military campaigns shifting westward toward Europe, shipping allocations for India expanded modestly. Wheat from Australia and rice from other parts of the subcontinent arrived in larger quantities, entering Bengal's markets by rail and river. These shipments did not erase the deficit, but they slowed the rapid price rises that had defined 1943. By early 1945, the price of rice, though still high by pre-war standards, had stabilized enough to permit greater access for those with some income. Relief administration, too, became more structured. The chaotic and corrupt networks of 1943 were gradually replaced with more centralized oversight under Viceroy Wavell's direction. Larger-scale kitchens operated in Calcutta, and provincial authorities began to enforce more consistent rationing schemes. These systems remained limited, often bypassing the rural poor who had suffered most, but they marked an improvement over the fragmented initiatives of the previous year. The presence of more visible government distribution helped reduce panic buying and hoarding, calming the volatile swings of the market. The shift in military strategy also altered the demand on Bengal's resources. With the Japanese advance halted and Allied forces on the offensive in Burma by 1944, the sense of imminent invasion that had justified denial policies diminished. Grain previously diverted to military reserves was gradually released to civilian markets, and transport previously commandeered for the army became available for food distribution. The restoration of some river traffic, after partial relaxation of earlier restrictions, reconnected districts long cut off from the main flow of trade. Yet the easing of scarcity did not repair the damage. Villages remained depopulated, households stripped of land, tools, and cattle, and children orphaned or sold during the famine's height. Many survivors were left permanently weakened, bearing the marks of prolonged malnutrition. Disease continued to claim lives even after rice reappeared, as weakened immune systems succumbed to infections. Relief administrators confronted populations too frail to recover quickly, and fields in some districts lay fallow despite the improved harvest because laborers had died or migrated. The social fabric of Bengal carried new fractures. Land had changed hands on a vast scale, with moneylenders and landlords consolidating properties acquired during the famine. Families who had sold plots for survival now worked as tenants or wage laborers on what had once been their own land. Inequality deepened, and the promise of recovery was unevenly distributed. For those who had profited through speculation or war contracts, the return of grain secured their prosperity. For the dispossessed, it meant the beginning of a new cycle of dependence. Politically, the shift in conditions did little to restore trust in the colonial administration. Survivors remembered the months of neglect and the refusal of London to divert resources when they were most needed. Relief efforts that expanded in 1944 were perceived less as acts of benevolence than as belated measures that arrived only after millions had died. Nationalist leaders seized upon this perception, reinforcing the argument that empire's priorities were military and economic rather than humanitarian. The improvement of conditions could not erase the visible evidence of failure that lined the streets of Calcutta or the abandoned homes of the countryside. For the British authorities, however, the return of better harvests and increased imports provided a measure of political reprieve. Mortality rates declined, the spectacle of bodies on Calcutta's streets lessened, and international criticism softened as famine headlines receded. Officials presented the improved conditions as evidence of recovery, but the deeper reality was that Bengal's society and economy had been reshaped in ways that could not be reversed by a single harvest. The famine had redistributed land, labor, and trust in ways that altered the province's trajectory. In global terms, the famine's visibility diminished as Allied campaigns advanced into Burma and Europe. Military victories shifted attention away from Bengal, and international observers turned their focus to new theaters of war. Yet within the province, memories remained vivid. Survivors continued to describe the famine years as a rupture, a time when the state failed to protect and when hunger redefined existence. For them, the arrival of more rice in 1944 did not mark resolution, but survival after irrevocable loss. As Bengal moved into 1945, the famine's grip loosened. But the consequences persisted in altered land ownership, scarred bodies, and the knowledge that millions had died within an empire that claimed to fight for freedom and civilization. Relief shipments continued to arrive, harvests returned to steadier levels, and the machinery of administration reasserted itself. But the legitimacy of imperial rule had already been weakened by the memory of famine. The question that lingered was not only how Bengal would recover, but what place such a catastrophe would occupy in the broader story of empire and war. When famine eased in Bengal, the land was altered not only by hunger, but by the memories, resentments, and structural changes it had left behind. The human losses were staggering. Estimates varied, but contemporary inquiries and later demographic studies placed the death toll between 2 and 3 million. The absence of complete records reflected both the chaos of the years and the reluctance of officials to document mortality too closely. Yet the scale was evident in every district, in villages where entire lineages had vanished, and in Calcutta neighborhoods where orphans and widows made up the majority of survivors. For those who lived, survival carried scars that shaped their future. Malnutrition left lasting damage to health, with weakened bodies more vulnerable to disease long after food returned. Families fractured by death or migration seldom reassembled. Children raised in orphanages or in the care of strangers grew up separated from kin and community. Psychological memories of famine haunted survivors, creating an enduring fear of scarcity that influenced household behavior for decades. Stockpiling rice, reducing meals at the first sign of shortage, and distrusting promises of government aid. The famine also reshaped Bengal's economy. Land transfers carried out under duress left a legacy of concentration. Landlords and moneylenders, who had acquired property during 1943, entered the post-war years with enlarged estates, while countless peasants became tenants or wage laborers on what had once been their own fields. This structural shift hardened rural inequality and fed the conditions for agrarian discontent in the years to come. The erosion of smallholdings, combined with demographic loss, ensured that Bengal entered the late 1940s with a weakened agrarian base. Urban society bore its own marks. Calcutta's expansion during the famine left the city with tens of thousands of destitute migrants who never returned to their villages. Some integrated into the city's labor force, swelling the ranks of rickshaw pullers, dock workers, and domestic servants. Others remained marginal, living in slums that expanded across the city's periphery. The famine accelerated the process of urbanization, but in forms that reinforced poverty rather than opportunity. Politically, the famine's legacy was profound. It delegitimized British rule in the eyes of millions of Indians. Nationalists drew upon the memory of 1943 as a symbol of imperial neglect, citing the famine in speeches, pamphlets, and campaigns that pressed for independence. The image of Britain as a protector of its subjects had been shattered. Indian leaders argued that if empire could not prevent the starvation of millions in one of its richest provinces, it had forfeited the right to govern. In Bengal, the famine deepened political fragmentation. The Muslim League's reputation suffered, with accusations that its administration in Calcutta had failed to protect rural populations. Congress, though suppressed during the war, drew strength from the widespread perception that famine was the product of imperial priorities. Leftist groups, particularly the Communist Party, gained ground by mobilizing relief and presenting themselves as defenders of the poor. The famine, in this way, altered the political balance of the province, strengthening movements that would shape the turbulent years of partition and independence. Internationally, the famine left a stain on Britain's wartime record. Reports that reached the United States, China, and other allied nations revealed an empire unable, or unwilling, to prevent mass death in its own territories. At a moment when Britain claimed to fight for liberty and justice against fascism, Bengal stood as a contradiction. American officials, already skeptical of imperialism, cited the famine as evidence that colonialism was incompatible with modern values. Though wartime alliances muted public criticism, the memory persisted into the post-war debates about decolonization. The famine also provoked a reckoning in historiography and public discourse. British officials attempted to attribute the crisis to natural causes, cyclones, crop disease, and population pressure, while minimizing the role of policy. Yet Indian writers and later historians emphasized the impact of denial policies, market failures, and wartime priorities. Over time, the consensus moved toward recognizing the famine as a man-made disaster, amplified by decisions that placed military needs above human survival. Scholarly debate continued, but the central question was no longer whether nature or empire bore responsibility. It was how imperial governance had converted shortage into catastrophe. Culturally, the famine became embedded in Bengal's collective memory. Writers, artists, and filmmakers portrayed the suffering of 1943 in works that shaped public understanding. Paintings by Zainal Abidin captured skeletal figures with stark simplicity, becoming iconic representations of hunger. Literature depicted the disintegration of rural households, the migration to Calcutta, and the moral dilemmas of survival. These cultural expressions ensured that the famine was remembered not only as an event of death, but as an enduring moral indictment of a political order. The famine's legacy also influenced post-war policy. Indian politicians, both before and after independence, cited 1943 as justification for stronger commitments to food security. The push for agricultural self-sufficiency, the expansion of state grain reserves, and the establishment of rationing systems all bore the imprint of the famine years. The memory of starvation shaped priorities in ways that continued long after the empire departed. Yet for survivors, legacy was less about policy than about absence. Villages remembered those who never returned. Households recalled the loss of fathers or children, and communities preserved oral histories of suffering. In these memories, famine was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a pattern of vulnerability under colonial rule. Families repeated stories of how the empire destroyed boats, hoarded grain, or diverted supplies while millions starved. These accounts, passed across generations, ensured that Bengal's famine remained alive in popular consciousness long after the immediate scars faded. By 1945, Bengal had begun to move beyond the worst famine in its modern history, but its legacy endured in weakened bodies, altered property relations, and political mistrust. The famine had demonstrated the limits of empire's concern for its subjects and had transformed Bengal's society in ways that would reverberate through the final years of British rule. The memory of starvation stood as both testimony and warning, a reminder of what had been endured and a question of what would follow in the struggle for independence and after.